Snow came early that year. It swept down the mountain in a quiet fury, coating the roofs of Hollow Creek like a warning. The first flakes arrived in October, dusting the tops of the pines and silencing the forest trails. In the village below, the locals murmured that the winter ahead would be cruel, colder than any they'd seen in 20 years. And when they spoke of who wouldn't make it, one name always slipped through the gossip like a curse: Nora Whitfield. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "She's too weak," said Mrs. Crenshaw, the baker's wife, shaking her head as she wrapped loaves for the afternoon customers. "Can't even carry her own firewood, bless her. That old cabin up there's half broken, and she's got no husband, no kin. She won't last till February." The men in the tavern agreed. "Used to be her daddy's land," muttered one, a farmer with frost-stained hands. "But since he passed, she's just been playing mountain woman. Ain't no way she'll make it through a storm season like this one." Up on the ridge, Nora heard every whisper the wind carried. Her cabin stood alone among the black pines, a mile above the village, where the air was thinner and the snow gathered in drifts taller than her knees. The structure creaked in the cold, its roof patched with tar paper and hope. But it was hers, every splinter, every knot in the wood. She was not weak. Not anymore. When her father died 3 winters ago, Nora inherited the cabin, the 10 acres of frost-bitten mountain, and a lifetime of his silence. He'd been a miner, the kind who spoke with his hands, not his voice. He taught her how to mend fences, how to set a snare, how to listen to the woods. But he never told her how to survive without him. Now she was learning. That morning, Nora pulled on her threadbare coat and trudged through the snow toward the wood line, her axe slung across her shoulder. The cold bit through her gloves as she worked, splitting logs one by one. Every swing sent pain jolting up her arms, but she didn't stop. Not when her breath turned white in the air, not when her back ached, not when the village's words replayed in her mind like a taunt. "She's too weak to survive winter." She split another log clean through. At midday, she paused to sip from her canteen and stared out across the valley. Smoke rose from the village chimneys far below, where the townsfolk huddled close to stoves and gossip. The sun was low already, throwing long blue shadows across the snow. Winter wasn't just coming, it was here. That night, the temperature dropped to 15 below. Inside the cabin, Nora huddled near the fire, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The flames crackled, throwing soft light over the room's rough-hewn walls. A single oil lamp flickered on the table beside her journal, a small leather book she'd filled with sketches, notes about the weather, and fragments of her father's wisdom. "If you can hear the trees creak, the storm's about to speak," he'd once told her. The trees were creaking now. A low moan rose from outside as the wind swept through the forest. The storm had begun. Snow whipped against the windows like handfuls of sand, and the old cabin shuddered under its force. Nora fed the fire again, stacking logs carefully. She would need to ration them. There were only so many left, and the woodpile outside was half buried already. Around midnight, she heard it, a faint scratching at the door. Her breath caught. No one came this high up at dark. She reached for her father's hunting rifle and crept to the entryway. The scratching came again, slow, desperate. She unlatched the door and opened it just enough to see the shape huddled on her porch. It was a dog, thin, shivering, its fur clumped with ice. "Oh, you poor thing," she murmured, setting the rifle aside. She knelt and coaxed the animal inside. It stumbled forward, collapsing beside the hearth. Its ribs showed through its coat, and one of its paws was bleeding. She wrapped it in an old quilt and warmed water on the fire to clean the wound. When she finished, the dog lifted its head weakly and looked at her with one amber eye. "You can stay," she whispered, stroking its fur. "Looks like we both need saving." By morning, the blizzard had sealed the cabin shut. The door was packed with snow, and the world outside was a white blur. Nora melted snow in a pot for water and fed the dog a bit of dried meat. She named him Ash for the color of his fur. Days passed. The storm didn't let up. She rationed her food, burned through her firewood faster than planned, and learned to patch drafts with old blankets. Every morning she checked the traps near the tree line for rabbits, but they were empty. When the wind quieted on the 5th day, she finally dug her way out. The mountain looked different, quiet, untouched, almost holy. She strapped on her snowshoes and hiked toward the lower ridge to cut more wood. The cold was sharp enough to sting her eyes, but she felt something stirring in her chest, something fierce, unbreakable. For the first time in months, she smiled. In the distance, she saw smoke rising from a cabin that wasn't hers. It belonged to Tom Harlan, a farmer who'd once offered her help and later told everyone she wasn't strong enough for the mountain. Nora watched the smoke twist into the sky, then turned back to her path. She had no time for pride or gossip. Survival didn't care who believed in her. But by the time winter ended, every soul in Hollow Creek would. The storm had passed, but winter's silence lingered like a bruise. The mountain was still, every tree glazed with frost, every rock buried beneath a white shroud. The only sound was the crunch of Nora's boots as she trudged through the snow, the axe slung across her back. Ash padded beside her, limping slightly, his breath puffing in the cold. He was recovering, but slowly. Nora had wrapped his injured paw in a strip of cloth torn from her underskirt, and every night she rubbed his fur by the fire until he stopped shivering. "Come on, boy," she murmured, her voice muffled by the scarf tied around her face. "We've got work to do." The path to the lower ridge was steep, shaded by evergreens that whispered secrets when the wind moved through them. It had been her father's favorite place to cut wood, trees tall and strong enough to last through a whole winter. But when Nora reached the clearing, she froze. The trees were gone. All of them. Stumps jutted from the snow like broken teeth, sawed clean by someone's hand. She knelt beside one, touching the smooth edge. The cut was fresh, only a few days old. Tom Harlan, she whispered bitterly. He owned land bordering hers, and he'd always eyed her wood with envy. He'd offered to buy her ridge last spring for a fraction of what it was worth, claiming he didn't want to see her freeze out here alone. She refused, politely but firmly. Now she saw what that meant. The wood she had planned to chop was gone, stolen before she could even get to it. Her hands tightened on the axe handle. "Guess we'll find another way," she said to Ash, her breath fogging the air. By dusk, she had gathered only a few armfuls of fallen branches. It wasn't enough. The cold deepened with every passing hour, and her firewood pile at home was already half gone. She could make it through another week, maybe 2, but after that... No, she refused to think that way. Back in the cabin, she fed the fire and warmed her hands. Ash lay beside her, resting his head on her boot. The flames painted the walls gold, softening the lines of the old wooden furniture her father had built long ago. On the mantel above the hearth, a framed photograph showed him standing proudly in front of a mine entrance, his arms slung around a younger Nora. He had believed in hard work, silence, and the dignity of self-reliance. But as she sat there, watching the shadows flicker, she wondered if sometimes pride did more harm than good. The next morning, she decided to head into the village. It had been nearly 3 weeks since she had gone down the mountain. The trail was still half buried, but the snow had hardened enough to walk on. She packed a small sled with jars of preserved berries, a few hand-carved ornaments, and a knitted shawl she'd made.
If she could sell them at the general store, she might afford a little kerosene or a few sacks of flour. Ash followed her halfway, then stopped at the edge of the frozen creek. "Stay," she told him gently. "I'll be back before dark." The village of Hollow Creek looked different in winter. Smoke curled from chimneys, and snow piled high against fences and barns. Children slid down the main road on old tin sleds, their laughter echoing between the buildings. But when Nora walked past, the laughter faded. "Lord, that's her," whispered a woman near the well. "The one living up there alone." "She looks thinner," another murmured. "Told you she wouldn't last." Nora kept her chin high. She'd learned long ago that silence could be armor.
Inside the general store, the owner, Mr. Pembroke, gave her a wary smile. "Miss Whitfield," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Been a while since I've seen you. What brings you down today?" She placed the sled's contents on the counter. "Trade," she said simply. "Handmade. Fair price." He examined the shawl, nodding approvingly. "Fine stitching. My wife would love this." As he tallied her total, the door creaked open behind her. Tom Harlan stepped in, brushing snow off his coat. His beard was thick with frost, and his boots looked freshly oiled. "Well, if it ain't the mountain woman," he drawled. "Heard you been keeping company with wolves up there." Nora didn't turn around. "Better than keeping company with thieves." Pembroke froze mid-count. Now. Tom chuckled darkly. "You talking about that ridge of yours? Those trees were on my land, sweetheart. Survey markers don't lie." "They were my father's," Nora said coldly, "and you know it." The room went still. Even the fire in the stove seemed to hush. Tom leaned close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "You think you're something special up there, playing at being tough. But when that cold finally breaks you, you'll come begging for help. They always do." Nora looked him straight in the eye. "When that day comes, you'll be the last person I ask." She took her payment, 3 silver coins and a sack of flour, and left without another word. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Snowflakes spiraled through the air like ashes. She pulled her hood tighter and began the long climb home. Halfway up the ridge, the sky darkened. Clouds gathered fast, swallowing the peaks. The storm was returning. She pushed through the wind, every step a battle. Her fingers went numb, her breath burned her throat, but she refused to stop. Somewhere behind her, she thought she heard the crack of branches, something moving through the trees. "Just the wind," she muttered, though her pulse quickened. When she finally reached the cabin, she collapsed inside, slamming the door against the rising gale. Ash barked and rushed to her side, licking snow from her face. She laughed weakly, trembling from exhaustion. "We made it, boy." But as the night wore on and the storm howled louder than before, she realized something else. This wasn't an ordinary blizzard. The wind carried a sound that didn't belong, a faint rumbling beneath the earth, a distant cracking like thunder underfoot. The mountain was shifting, and by dawn, the snowdrifts outside her door would be the least of her problems. The mountain groaned. It started as a low, distant rumbling beneath the floorboards, a vibration that rattled the oil lamp and sent a few flakes of snow tumbling from the rafters. Nora sat upright, heart pounding. Ash growled from the foot of the bed, his fur bristling. "Easy, boy, it's just a storm." But it wasn't. The sound grew deeper, rolling, grinding, like the earth itself was waking from a long sleep. The fire flickered. Then came a sharp crack from outside, followed by the unmistakable roar of something massive breaking free. Nora threw on her coat and grabbed the lantern. When she opened the door, freezing air tore through the cabin. The night was white and wild. Snow swirled so thick she could barely see past the porch. But through the blizzard's veil, she saw it. An entire section of the ridge collapsing, trees snapping like matchsticks as tons of rock and ice thundered down the slope. Her breath caught. The landslide was headed toward Hollow Creek. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen in shock. Then, instinct took over. She raced back inside, tossing supplies into her old canvas pack. Rope, flares, a small shovel, a coil of wire, a handful of jerky. "Come on, Ash," she shouted. The dog barked once, limping to the door, his tail tucked low. They set out into the storm. The snow was waist-deep in places, the wind howling so fiercely it nearly knocked her off her feet. She followed the ridge down, her lantern swinging wildly. The mountain's rumbling continued, echoing through her bones. Somewhere far below, she thought she heard screams. By the time she reached the lower slope, dawn was just a gray smear behind the clouds. The storm had quieted enough for her to see the destruction. Trees uprooted, boulders strewn across the valley, and the faint orange glow of lanterns moving through the wreckage. The slide had missed most of the village, but Tom Harlan's farm, the one that bordered her land, was half buried. Nora's jaw tightened. She should have felt some satisfaction. Justice, maybe. But all she felt was urgency. She broke into a run, sliding down the slope on her boots. When she reached the edge of the wreckage, she found 3 men from the village digging frantically with shovels and bare hands. "Tom, he's still in there!" one shouted. Nora dropped her pack. "Where?" The man turned, blinking in disbelief. "Whitfield, what are you doing here?" "Helping," she said, already plunging her hands into the snow. Together they dug until their fingers bled, until their arms ached so badly they could barely lift another shovelful. The snow was dense and mixed with mud and shattered wood. At one point, Nora found a broken lantern still flickering beneath the debris. Then she heard it, a faint cough. "Over here!" she yelled. They tore through the last layer, uncovering a small pocket of air beneath a collapsed beam. Tom lay inside, half buried, his leg twisted at an angle that made her stomach turn. His face was pale, lips blue, eyes glassy with pain. "Nora," he croaked, disbelief heavy in his voice. "Don't talk," she said, kneeling beside him. "Save your strength." She used the rope from her pack to brace the beam, then slipped the shovel handle under it for leverage. The other men helped lift, grunting with effort, until the wood shifted just enough for her to pull Tom free. He screamed as his leg moved, but she didn't stop. She tore strips from her coat and bound the wound as best she could, packing snow around it to slow the swelling. When they finally got him to solid ground, the other men hesitated. "The bridge is gone," one said. "We can't carry him down to town." "Then we take him to my cabin," Nora said firmly. "It's closer." Tom tried to protest, but his voice failed him. He passed out before she even finished speaking. It took them nearly 2 hours to reach the cabin. The trail was slippery, the wind biting. Nora led the way, breaking the path through deep snow, refusing to slow even when her lungs burned. When she finally reached her porch, she was trembling from exhaustion. She opened the door and warmth spilled out, the fire still alive from embers she'd banked before leaving. "Lay him here," she said, motioning to the cot. They did, carefully lowering Tom onto the blankets. One of the men fetched water from the pot over the fire, while Nora cleaned the dirt from his face and checked his pulse. "He's breathing steady," she murmured. "Best we can do till help comes," said a villager. "We'll head back for the doctor when the road clears." When they left, Nora sat by the cot, staring at the man who'd mocked her only days ago. He looked small now, fragile. His rough hands trembled even in sleep. Ash curled at her feet, his head resting on his paws. Nora fed another log to the fire and whispered, "Guess pride don't keep anyone warm, does it?" That night, she barely slept. The wind screamed outside, but she stayed awake tending to Tom's fever, keeping the fire alive, melting snow for water. At one point, he stirred, his voice hoarse. "Why, why'd you come?" he asked weakly. She wrung out a cloth and placed it on his forehead. "Because someone had to." He gave a bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "Didn't think you had it in you." "Neither did they," she said quietly. "But I do." He looked at her for a long time before closing his eyes again. When dawn finally came, the storm had eased. The world outside was silver and still, and smoke rose gently from her chimney. Down in the village, people would see it and whisper. They'd say the mountain woman had survived yet another night. But soon, they'd learn she hadn't just survived. She'd saved the man who doubted her most, and before winter ended, she would save them all. For 3 days, Nora hardly left the cabin. Tom drifted in and out of consciousness, fever burning through him like wildfire. His leg had swollen beneath the makeshift splint, and the wound festered despite her best efforts. Each time she peeled back the bandage to clean it, the smell of infection turned her stomach. "Don't you quit on me," she muttered as she dabbed his forehead with a damp cloth. "You don't get to mock me and then die in my house." Ash barked softly from the corner, as if in agreement. "That's right, boy. He's got some apologizing to do." The snow outside had stopped falling, but the drifts were high enough to bury fences and block the road into Hollow Creek. No one had come up the ridge. The world felt smaller.
4 days. You were lucky. He gave a humorless chuckle. Doesn't feel lucky. You'd be under 10 feet of ice if I hadn't dragged you out of that slide. He looked at her, guilt flickering behind his eyes. Why'd you do it? Telling and preparing the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Nora shrugged. Because it was the right thing. No, he said, voice low. After what I said, what I took. She paused. The trees? He nodded. I cut your line. Figured you wouldn't notice till spring. Thought maybe you'd finally give up that ridge. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Tom shifted, wincing as pain shot up his leg. Guess the mountain decided to punish me before you could. I don't punish people. I just endure them. As the days passed, his fever broke, the color returned to his face, and the cabin no longer smelled of sickness. He still couldn't walk, but he began to talk, to really talk. He told her about his farm, how the frost had ruined his crops 2 years in a row, how his wife's grave sat under the old maple tree behind the barn. He spoke of loneliness, of desperation, of the way pride made a man do foolish things. Nora listened, but rarely answered. When she did, her words were measured, deliberate. I know something about foolish pride. My father had enough for both of us. Never asked for help, not once, even when his lungs gave out from the dust in the mines. She poked at the flames with a stick, her eyes far away. He told me to stay strong, to never depend on anyone, but he never told me how to carry all that silence. Tom nodded slowly. Maybe we both learned the hard way. By the end of the week, his strength began to return. Nora helped him stand for the first time, her shoulder braced under his arm. You sure you can do this? He gritted his teeth. If I can survive your nursing, I can survive anything. She laughed, a rare sound, quiet but genuine. Careful, or I'll toss you back down the hill. Together they made it to the doorway. The air outside was sharp and clear, the valley below gleaming under a pale sun. Smoke rose from Hollow Creek again, Life had resumed, even if winter still clung stubbornly to the trees. Tom stared out over the ridge for a long time. They must think I'm dead. Maybe, Nora said, but they'll know soon enough you're not. You just owe them, and me, a few apologies first. He smiled faintly. You've got some bite in you after all. Always did. You just weren't paying attention. That night, as she sat journaling by the fire, she heard something unusual, a faint knocking at the door. Ash perked up immediately, tail wagging. Nora froze. No one came up this high at night. She set her journal aside and grabbed the lantern. When she opened the door, 3 villagers stood outside, bundled in coats, faces red from the cold. Mr. Pembroke, the storekeeper, said, "Miss Whitfield, we came looking for Tom. Folks feared the worst after the slide. You found him?" She stepped aside. "He's inside. Hurt, but alive." The men filed in, astonished. Tom waved weakly from the cot. "Guess the rumors of my death were a bit early," he rasped. Pembroke turned to Nora. "You saved him?" She nodded. The men exchanged glances. For once, there was no mockery in their eyes, just awe. "Word'll spread fast," Pembroke said. "The whole town'll want to thank you." Nora looked down, suddenly self-conscious. "I didn't do it for thanks." Tom's voice cut in softly. "No. But they need to know who they've been wrong about." The villagers stayed long enough to promise help. Extra firewood, supplies, a doctor from the next town over when the roads cleared. When they left, Nora stood in the doorway, watching their lanterns flicker down the trail like little stars. The village that once whispered she was too weak to survive winter was now climbing the mountain to offer her aid. And deep in her chest, something long frozen began to thaw. The road into Hollow Creek opened 3 days later. When Nora stepped outside that morning, the sky was blue for the first time in weeks. The storm clouds had finally broken, revealing peaks sharp and white as ivory. The pines glittered under sunlight, and the snow softened just enough to let water trickle from the rocks. Winter wasn't over, but it was loosening its grip. Nora stacked the last of her firewood along the cabin wall, her hands raw from chopping. Ash trotted at her heels, tail wagging, his limp almost gone. Inside, Tom sat propped against a pillow. Legs still bound, but color had returned to his face. "You should be resting," she said, as she came in, brushing snow from her coat. "I've done enough resting to last a lifetime," he muttered, trying to sit taller. "If I stay in this bed another day, I'll start growing roots." She smiled faintly. "Well, don't go planting yourself on my floor. I just swept it." Tom chuckled, weak but genuine. "You've got more fire in you than any man in this valley." "I've had to," she said quietly, pouring tea from the kettle. "Fire is the only thing that keeps you alive up here." That afternoon, a small group arrived from the village, men carrying wood and flour, women with baskets of canned fruit and blankets. The doctor came too, trudging up the trail behind them with a black satchel swinging from his shoulder. When she opened the door, every one of them looked startled. The gossip of Hollow Creek had painted her as a fragile thing, gaunt, half-starved, more ghost than woman. But standing there in her wool coat, cheeks flushed with color, eyes sharp as flint, she looked nothing like their stories. "Miss Whitfield," the doctor said, pulling off his gloves. "Heard quite a tale about you." She stepped aside. "He's in here." Tom greeted them with a grin. "She saved my hide. You ought to put her name in the church book right next to the saints." Laughter rippled through the room, uneasy at first, then warmer. The doctor examined Tom's leg, nodding approvingly, and said, "You've done a fine job keeping this clean. How'd you learn to set a splint?" "My father was a miner. You learn fast when help is a 2-hour climb away." Mr. Pembroke, who had returned with the group, looked around the cabin, at the neatly stacked logs, the traps by the door, the shelves of preserved food. "You've done all this on your own." She shrugged. "The mountain teaches you to use what you have." Another villager, Mrs. Crenshaw, stepped forward, her cheeks pink from the embarrassment. We misjudged you, dear. We all did." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence said enough. That evening, when the visitors had gone and Tom slept soundly, Nora sat outside on the porch. The sky had turned violet, and the stars pricked through one by one. The cold nipped at her nose, but the air felt alive again, less cruel, more forgiving. Ash lay beside her, his head resting on her boots. Below, the village lights shimmered faintly through the trees. For the first time in years, she didn't feel completely apart from them. Maybe she never needed their approval. Maybe all she had needed was for them to see her truth. A voice stirred behind her. "They'll talk about this for years, you know." She turned to see Tom leaning on the doorframe, a blanket over his shoulders. "They'll say you're half wild, but twice as strong as any man who's ever tried this mountain." Nora looked back towards the valley. "Let them talk. I'm done listening to small words from smaller people." Tom smiled deeper. "I saved your life, Nora. I don't know how to repay that." "Don't," she said simply. "Just live better than you did before." He nodded, eyes reflecting firelight from the cabin window. "I intend to. And when spring comes, I'll help you replant your trees, every last one I took." Her throat tightened. She hadn't realized how much she had needed to hear that. "Thank you."
By the time she reached the creek, the wind had nearly blinded her. The faint light turned out to be a lantern half buried in snow beside a slumped figure. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice nearly carried away by the gale. No answer. She knelt, brushing snow from a man's face, a hunter by the look of his coat and rifle strap. His skin was pale, ice crusting in his beard. He was still breathing, but shallowly. Nora didn't think. She hooked her arm under his and dragged him up the hill, one agonizing step at a time. The climb felt endless, her muscles burning, lungs raw from the cold. But she remembered her father's words from long ago. "You don't quit on a soul in trouble. The mountain doesn't forgive that." By the time they reached the cabin, her vision swam. She kicked the door open, hauled him inside, and slammed it shut behind her. She stoked the dying fire with her last logs, then stripped off his frozen coat, rubbing his arms and chest to bring warmth back into him. Slowly, his eyes fluttered open, blue, wild, disoriented. "You dragged me," he rasped. "You'd have done the same," Nora said quietly, feeding the flames with scraps of bark. He tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "Name's Carter. Trapped out here looking for elk before the storm hit. Thought I'd make it to the ridge. Didn't." Nora handed him a tin cup of broth, thin but hot. "Drink. Talk later." As the blizzard raged on, the cabin became their small world. Nora worked like a machine, feeding the fire, checking Carter's frostbite, melting snow for water. They spoke little, the wind howling like a wounded animal outside. By dawn, the storm had passed. The silence that followed was haunting. Carter sat up, rubbing his stiff hands. "You saved my life," he said simply. "No one from the village would have dared to come out in that." Nora didn't look at him. "They said I wouldn't survive the winter. Guess I proved him wrong. And now you have too." He smiled faintly. "It seems this mountain's got a few lessons to teach them." Nora opened the shutters. Outside, the world sparkled. Every branch glazed in sunlight and frost. Her breath caught at the beauty of it. Carter watched her, his expression unreadable. "You're not what they say, are you?" She turned toward him, her face soft but firm. "No one ever is." For the first time that season, Nora felt something other than hunger and fear. She felt connection, a reminder that even in the wildest cold, hearts could still thaw. And far below, when the villagers saw smoke rising again from Nora's cabin, steady, strong, and sure, they whispered to one another. The weak woman on the mountain. She's still alive? But this time, there was no laughter, only silence, and perhaps, just perhaps, a little shame. When the storm finally passed, the mountain seemed to hold its breath. Every tree dripped with silver melt, every snowbank gleamed under the pale sun. For 3 days, Nora Hale and Carter stayed inside, rebuilding their strength. The cabin, once a lonely fortress, now felt alive with another heartbeat. Carter was rough around the edges, a hunter used to solitude, but he was kind in the quiet ways that mattered. He helped repair the roof where the ice had cracked the beams, sharpened her tools, and carried water from the creek when the snow softened enough to cross. Still, Nora wasn't used to company. Each night, when the fire dimmed, she found herself staring at the walls, trying to remember the sound of her own laughter. It had been so long since she'd shared a table, a meal, a silence that wasn't soaked in grief. One evening, Carter broke that silence. "You ever think of going back to the village?" he asked, his voice low. Nora shook her head. "They made it clear I wasn't wanted. Too stubborn, too strange, too weak." He snorted softly. "They wouldn't have lasted 2 nights up here. Weak, my foot." Nora smiled faintly. "They don't know what survival looks like. It's not pride or loud talk. It's quiet hands and steady breath. It's not dying when the world wants you gone." Carter nodded, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Then maybe you're the strongest one they've got." The words caught her off guard. Strong. She hadn't thought of herself that way in years, not since Daniel's death, not since the fever took her child and she'd run from the world rather than face its pity. But here, on this mountain, she had rebuilt something from the ashes. Over the next week, Carter grew stronger, though his frost-bitten fingers still ached. He insisted on hunting to repay her kindness. Nora refused at first. It was too dangerous, but she could see the restless guilt in his eyes. So she agreed, on one condition: he wouldn't go far. He returned that evening with a hare and a pheasant, both cleanly shot. As they cooked by the fire, Nora realized she had forgotten how it felt to eat until she was full. Later that night, Carter sat sharpening his knife. "I'm heading down to the village tomorrow," he said quietly. "Need to let them know I made it. They'll think I froze out there." Nora's face hardened, though she tried to hide it. "Then you should go." He looked up. "I'll tell them about you, Nora. How you saved my life. How you survived the worst winter in a generation." "Don't bother," she said, standing. But he saw the flicker of pain she tried to hide. The next morning he left just after dawn, promising to return with supplies. Nora watched his figure disappear through the trees, the snow swallowing his tracks behind him. For the first time in months, she was alone again. The silence felt heavier now, pressing at her chest. Days passed. She worked to stay busy, checking traps, repairing fences, gathering sap for syrup. But something gnawed at her, a sound, a sense. The forest seemed different. At first it was small, a snapped branch where none should have been. Then faint voices on the wind, too distant to place. On the fourth day, she climbed the ridge and froze. Smoke. Several columns of it, rising from the valley below. The villagers were coming. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from something deeper, a knowing. Carter must have told them. Nora went back to her cabin and stood in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame she had carved with her own hands. The mountain had tested her and found her worthy. The village had called her weak, and she had outlasted their doubts, their scorn, and even their pity. Now, they were coming up her mountain. She didn't know what they wanted, to mock, to thank, or to take. But one thing was certain. Nora Hale wasn't the same woman who'd come up here months ago. She was ready to face them. The morning they came, the forest stirred like it sensed a reckoning. Nora Hale stood outside her cabin, the wind catching the ends of her braid. From the slope below, figures appeared one by one, wrapped in wool and leather, their boots crunching through the melting snow. There must have been a dozen of them. The villagers, the same ones who'd laughed when she'd left before winter, whispering she'd be dead before spring thaw. And leading them was Carter. He looked different now, clean-shaven, rested, wearing the coat of someone who'd slept by a real hearth. But when his eyes met hers, something unspoken passed between them. Guilt, maybe. Or respect. Behind him came the elders, grisly men with hard eyes, and two women who'd once sold her flour and salt at double price. Nora said nothing as they stopped a few paces from her door. The headman, Amos Gray, cleared his throat. "Nora Hale," he said. "We came to see if it was true." "True? That I'm still breathing?" A murmur rippled through the group. Carter stepped forward. "They didn't believe me," he said softly. "I told them how I saved your life, how you survived the storm. They said no one could have lasted up here alone." Nora's gaze didn't leave the headman. "You told me when I left that I didn't need saving." He shifted uneasily. "The animal place for one woman to winter. You know that. But it seems you've proven us wrong." Nora crossed her arms, her breath misting in the cold air. "You said I was too weak to last. You said I'd crawl back begging before the snow melted. You said—" "We said a lot of things we shouldn't have," interrupted one of the women, Martha. Her voice trembled. "We thought you'd die, Nora. And when Carter came down from that blizzard saying you were alive, we didn't believe him. Not at first." And now, here they were, alive, fed, warm, staring at her like she was something out of legend. "You didn't come all this way just to see me breathing," she said finally. "What do you want?" Amos sighed, glancing behind him. "We lost half the lower barns this winter. Livestock froze, families went hungry. You found a way to make it through up here, without supply, without help. We came to ask, how?" The words hit her harder than she expected. The village that had cast her out now came to her for guidance. Carter stepped closer. "They need your knowledge, Nora. You built a system that worked when theirs failed. You could help them prepare for next winter. Teach them." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she turned, pushing open the cabin door. "Come inside," she said simply. They followed hesitantly. The cabin was small, but every inch told a story. Dried herbs hanging from the rafters, smoked fish stored in ash barrels, root vegetables kept cool in the floor pit. Her journal lay open on the table,
pages covered in careful notes and hand-drawn diagrams. Martha traced a finger over the page. "You did all this alone?" Nora nodded. "The mountain gives what you ask, if you learn to listen. The wind tells you where to find shelter. The birds tell you when the cold's coming back. You don't fight it. You learn its rhythm." Amos's gruff voice softened. "We were wrong about you." Nora met his gaze. "You were. But being wrong isn't a sin. Staying that way is." A silence fell. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth. Finally, Carter spoke. "If she hadn't found me that night, I'd be gone. You all know that. She saved my life and her own. I reckon we owe her more than just words." Amos nodded slowly. "You have a place among us again, Nora, if you'll have it." She looked at the group, at their tired faces and calloused hands. Once, their rejection had broken something in her. But now she felt no anger, only peace. "I have my place," she said softly, glancing toward the mountain peaks. "But I'll come down when you need me. I'll teach you what I know." Martha smiled, tears glinting. "You'd do that? After all we said?" Nora's lips curved faintly. "The mountain forgives those who learn. So will I." When they left, the sun was setting behind the pines, turning the snow to liquid gold. Carter lingered a moment, hand resting on the doorframe. "You meant what you said?" he asked quietly. "You'll come down?" "Sometimes. But this place, these hills, they made me who I am. I won't leave them behind." He smiled. "Then I'll come back up now and then, bring you coffee and news." She chuckled softly. "Bring salt. I'm running low." As he walked down the trail, she stood in the doorway, watching the village figures fade into the twilight. The cold brushed her skin, but it no longer felt cruel. Because this time, Nora Hale wasn't just surviving the mountain. She had become part of it. 2 weeks after the villagers' visit, Nora Hale woke to the acrid scent of smoke, thicker, darker than any hearth fire. It clawed at her lungs as she stumbled to the door. Down in the valley, black smoke was rising, not from one chimney, but from many. Her heart lurched. Fire. Without hesitation, she grabbed her satchel of herbs, her water skin, and the old horse she'd rescued from the snows, Rust. The animal snorted nervously, but obeyed, and together they tore down the mountain path, snowmelt splashing under their hooves. When she reached the edge of the village, chaos reigned. Flames devoured one of the barns, and sparks leapt from roof to roof, carried by the dry spring wind. Villagers ran with buckets from the creek, shouting over one another. Children cried. Smoke blotted the sky. Carter spotted her first. "Nora!" he shouted, sprinting toward her. His face was streaked with soot. "It started in the storage barn. Some fool left oil near the forge. We can't get it under control." Nora didn't waste words. She threw off her coat and took charge. "Start digging trenches, there, between the barns. Use the melted snow from the troughs. And you," he pointed to Amos, "take your men and wet down the roofs with the well buckets. Keep the sparks off the houses." For a moment, the villagers hesitated. Then, remembering who had survived the harshest winter alone, they obeyed. The mountain woman moved like she'd been born for it, quick, steady, unflinching. When a wall collapsed, she dragged a coughing boy to safety. When a woman screamed for her trapped husband, Nora plunged into the smoke, her coat wrapped over her mouth. She found him half-conscious under a beam, and Carter helped her carry him out. The fire raged for hours, but by dusk it began to die. The villagers had formed a bucket line, their arms trembling with exhaustion, but the flames finally began to surrender. When the last ember was crushed, The valley was quiet, except for coughing and the hiss of steam. Nora stood in the mud, her hair singed, face streaked with soot, watching as the orange glow faded to gray. Then she turned and saw the looks. Not of pity, not of doubt, but of awe. Amos approached her slowly, his voice hoarse. "You saved us, Nora. I said I'd help when I was needed. And the mountain doesn't turn its back on her people, even when they once turned theirs." He smiled faintly. "You're not just part of this mountain anymore. You're its spirit." The words hit her deeper than he knew. For months, she'd lived as if half alive, haunted by loss and solitude. But now, seeing the village standing, scarred but alive, she understood something new. Survival wasn't about isolation. It was about connection. It was about endurance that inspired others to rise too. As the villagers began to rebuild, Nora helped mend what she could. The women brought her bread and broth, whispering thanks. The children followed her as she showed them how to make ash salves for burns and soot poultices for coughs. That night, the valley gathered around the communal fire pit, one of the few things untouched by flame. Carter handed Nora a mug of hot cider, and for the first time in years, she sat among them. Martha, the old baker, spoke first. "When you left, we said you'd never make it through the cold, that you weren't strong enough." She looked down at her hands. "But you came back and saved us from the fire." "We were wrong, Nora. So wrong." Nora sipped the cider, the warmth spreading through her chest. "I wasn't wrong about you back then. I was weak once, broken, grieving, angry. The mountain changed that. It teaches you the hard way, or not at all." Carter leaned closer. "And now?" "Now," she said, staring into the flames, "I don't just survive winter. I understand it. The cold, the hunger, the silence, they're not enemies. They're teachers, and every lesson leaves you stronger." The villagers fell silent, watching her in the firelight. In that moment, they no longer saw a strange hermit woman or a foolish dreamer. They saw a survivor, a leader, a part of their story. When the fire burned low, Carter stood and helped her to her feet. "You're heading back up soon?" "Maybe," she said softly, "when the mountain says it's time." As she walked back to her horse, the villagers watched her go, some whispering blessings, others simply bowing their heads. The woman they'd once mocked as too weak to survive winter had become something more. Nora Hale, the mountain woman, had outlasted fire, frost, and fear. And as she climbed back toward the peaks, the first stars broke through the smoke-dark sky, glimmering like embers of a promise yet to come. By the time Nora Hale returned to her cabin, spring had claimed the mountain. The snow that had once buried her world was now only a faint shimmer on the farthest peaks. The trees dripped with dew, and the air smelled of pine and thawing earth. For the first time in a long while, the mountain felt alive again, alive in the way her heart did. She slid from Rust's saddle, patting the horse's neck. "Home," she murmured, smiling as the cabin came into view. Smoke still rose from its chimney, steady and sure, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. Inside, everything was as she'd left it. Her tools neatly hung, her herbs drying in the rafters, the journal open on the table. She ran her hand across the worn pages and exhaled. It was strange, she thought, how silence no longer...
Nora blinked. "What's this?" Carter smiled. "A token of thanks for the woman who proved us all wrong, for the one who taught us that surviving isn't luck, it's learning." She touched the medallion gently, her thumb tracing the lines. "I didn't do it for thanks." "I know. That's why you deserve it."
They stood in silence a while, watching the first snow begin to fall. Not heavy, not cruel this time, just soft flakes drifting like forgiveness from the sky. "You staying through winter again?" he asked finally. "Where else would I go?" she replied with a smile. "This mountain and I, we understand each other now." Carter laughed. "Then I'll keep bringing your salt and coffee. You keep reminding the rest of us what strength really looks like." As he rode away, Nora fastened the medallion around her neck. The silver gleamed against her coat like sunlight trapped in metal. That night, as she sat by her fire, she opened her journal once more. The pages were nearly full now, but there was still room for one last entry. "Winter will come again, as she always does, but this time I do not fear her. She is my sister, my teacher, my mirror. The mountain no longer tests me, it trusts me. And maybe, in her own way, she always did." She closed the book and placed it beside the medallion, letting the flame's reflection dance across their surfaces. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it a soft hum, the sound of snow on pine, of ice on bark, of a mountain breathing. Nora smiled. To anyone else, it might have been just wind, but to her, it was something more. It was the mountain whispering back, "You did well, daughter of the peaks." And in that moment, surrounded by the vast silence she once feared, Nora Hale felt a quiet joy, because she hadn't just survived the mountain, she had become part of its story forever. The following winter was unlike any other. It came down from the high peaks in slow, deliberate silence, covering the land in a soft, glimmering blanket. But this time, the village didn't tremble. Fires burned in well-built hearths. Smoke rose from sturdy chimneys. Granaries overflowed. And at the heart of it all, beyond the frozen pines high in the ridges, stood Nora Hale. She was no longer the woman people pitied. She had become something else entirely, a symbol of endurance, of rebirth, of the bond between people and the land that carried them. When the snows grew thick, she often heard footsteps on her porch, travelers seeking warmth or wisdom. Some brought food, some brought letters, and others brought stories of how her teachings had changed their lives. One evening, as the wind howled through the canyons, a knock came again. She opened the door to find a young woman, wrapped in a tattered shawl, her eyes hollow from hunger and fear. "Please," she whispered, "they said you could help me." Nora ushered her inside without hesitation, wrapping her in a blanket and setting a pot of stew to warm by the fire. "What's your name?" Nora asked softly. "Ilara," she said. "My husband was caught in a storm last week. I came looking for him, but I lost the trail. They told me you—" hesitated. "You can track anything." Nora's heart tightened. Memories of her first winter, of fear, of loss, rose like ghosts, but she smiled gently. "You came to the right place." At dawn, Nora saddled Rust and packed her old kit, flares, herbs, water, and a coil of rope. Ilara followed close, hope flickering in her tired eyes. The wind bit hard, but Nora moved with confidence, reading the snow as easily as others read words. She pointed to the faint depressions leading into the forest. "Your husband came this way. The prints are a day old." Hours turned to dusk before they found him, half buried near a frozen stream, weak but alive. Together they lifted him onto Rust's back and made their slow way home. When they reached the cabin, Ilara wept into Nora's hands. "How did you know where to look?" Nora looked toward the peaks. The mountain always remembers its own. Word of the rescue spread quickly. By spring, people came not only for survival lessons, but for counsel, for courage, for peace. Hunters, widows, wanderers, all found their way to Nora Hale's door, and she welcomed them all. Carter returned often too. Together, they founded what became known as the High Ridge School of the Mountain, a simple lodge at the edge of the forest where anyone could learn the old ways: tracking, foraging, firekeeping, healing. The villagers once thought her too weak to last a single winter. Now they sent their sons and daughters to study beneath her roof. Years passed, and Nora's hair silvered like the frost on her cabin roof. She never left the mountain, though the world below changed with every season. Sometimes she'd climb to the highest ridge and look down at the valley, alive, thriving, safe, and smile. One autumn evening, as the sun sunk low behind the ridgeline, Carter found her sitting on a boulder, her old journal in her lap. "You still write?" he asked. "Always," she said. "The mountain never stops teaching." He sat beside her silent for a long moment. "You know, Nora, someday, when we're gone, people will tell your story like a legend." She cluttered softly. "Let them. Just make sure they remember this. It wasn't me who conquered the mountain. It was the mountain that showed me who I was." The wind rose, brushing through the pines. Below them, the lights of the village twinkled like fireflies in the dusk. Carter smiled. "Then I guess you became one of her own." Nora closed her journal and gazed toward the snow-tipped peaks. "No," she whispered, "I always was." And as the stars came out, clear and bright over the ridge, the mountain seemed to hum softly in reply, its voice woven into the wind. "Strength is not born, it is remembered." It had been 15 years since Nora Hale first walked into the mountains alone. The once feared hermit woman was now a figure of wisdom, her name spoken with reverence far beyond High Ridge Valley. Farmers, hunters, even townsfolk from distant settlements would climb the mountain paths just to hear her speak. But Nora was slowing down. Her hands, once sure and steady, had begun to tremble when she carved wood or wrote in her journal. Still, her eyes remained bright, her voice strong as mountain wind. One crisp morning, a girl arrived at her cabin, barely 16, with chestnut hair tied in a braid and curiosity blazing in her eyes. She introduced herself shyly. "My name is Mara. My mother is Ilara, the one you saved." Nora smiled. "Then you've come from good people." Mara nodded. "Mama said I should learn from you. She said you could teach me how to listen to the mountain." Those words struck Nora deep. Few understood what it truly meant to listen, to read the land, to feel its pulse in wind and water. She poured the girl tea, then nodded toward the forest. "If you wish to learn, you must first learn to be silent." And so Mara began her apprenticeship. For weeks, she followed Nora across ridges and valleys, learning to track animals by broken branches, to predict storms by scent alone, to find water by reading the moss. Nora taught her how to tend fire in wind, how to store roots and herbs, and, most importantly, how to respect the mountain. At night, they sat by the fire, Nora telling stories of the first winter, of how fear had nearly broken her, and how it had also remade her. "You'll face your own winter one day," Nora told her. "Everyone does. But remember, strength isn't what you show others, it's what you build when no one's watching." Mara listened with the quiet focus of someone born for the high places. She asked questions about the spirits of the peaks, about the voices in the wind. "Are they real?" she asked one night. Nora smiled softly. "They're as real as you let them be. Sometimes the mountain speaks in storms, sometimes in silence. Either way, it always answers." As the seasons turned, Nora saw her younger self in Mara. The same determination, the same wildness, the same bond with the land. But she also saw something more, the promise of a future she could trust the mountain to hold. When winter came again, Nora grew ill, not suddenly, but quietly, like the fading of a long, gentle song. Carter and the villagers visited often, bringing medicine, broth, and laughter. But Nora knew her time on the mountain was nearing an end. One night, as the snow fell soft as feathers outside, she called Mara to her bedside. "Do you know why I stayed?" she asked, her voice a whisper beneath the crackling fire. "Because the mountain saved you," Mara said. "No, child, because it reminded—"
10 years had passed since Nora Hale's last breath drifted into the mountain winds, but her spirit lingered in every pine needle and whisper of snow. Mara, now 26, stood outside the cabin that had once belonged to her mentor. It was her home now. The same stone hearth, the same creaking timbers, the same steady pulse of wilderness all around. The medallion of the rising sun and mountain glimmered against her coat, warm even in the cold. She had kept the High Ridge School alive. Each summer, villagers hiked up the ridge to learn. Young hunters, healers, mothers, and even those who once feared the mountain's power. Mara taught them what Nora had once taught her, how to live with the mountain, not against it. But this winter, something felt different. The air had changed. The snow came early, heavy and sharp, blanketing the forest weeks before its time. The animals had fled lower down. Even the trees seemed to groan beneath the frost. Carter's son, Thomas, now a grown man, rode up one evening with worry etched in his face. "The elders say this storm will be worse than any before," he said, shaking snow from his coat. "They're calling it the Iron Winter. If it lasts, half the valley could lose their crops." Mara's eyes flicked toward the mountains. The clouds above them were swollen and gray, moving like a living thing. "Then we prepare," she said firmly, "like Nora taught us." For the next 3 days, Mara organized the villagers, digging trenches to divert snowmelt, reinforcing roofs, teaching them to store dried herbs and salted meat. But as the storm gathered strength, it became clear this was no ordinary winter. On the 4th night, the blizzard struck. Winds howled down from the peaks like the cry of something ancient and wild. Snow slammed against the cabins, thick and relentless. The villagers huddled in their homes, fires burning low, praying the roofs would hold. Mara was at the schoolhouse when the first roof beam cracked. She heard the splintering sound through the storm, sharp as a gunshot. She ran into the night without hesitation, her coat snapping behind her. Thomas shouted after her, but she was already gone, fighting through the blinding snow toward the old mill where families had taken shelter. Inside, she found them. 3 children and their mother, terrified as the roof buckled under the weight of snow. Mara acted without thinking. She tied her rope to a support beam, climbed onto the roof in the screaming wind, and began to shovel off the snow with her gloved hands. Ice bit her fingers raw, but she didn't stop. The rope snapped. For a moment, the storm swallowed her whole, white and endless. She slid down the slope, tumbling, clawing, gasping for air. When she stopped, she was halfway down the ridge. Silence pressed around her. She tried to move, but her leg was pinned beneath a fallen branch. Panic flared, then faded into the rhythm of survival she had been trained for. "Mara, breathe. Listen." Nora's voice seemed to echo through the storm, not in her ears but in her bones. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath, and began to dig herself free. The cold bit deep, her strength waning, but then, faintly, she heard another sound, Rust's distant whinny. It couldn't be. Rust had been gone for years. But when she opened her eyes, through the veil of snow, she saw the outline of a horse standing just beyond the ridge, a silver-gray phantom against the storm. Mara's chest tightened. "Nora?" The horse turned its head as if urging her to follow. She dragged herself up, leaning on her staff, and limped towards it. Each step was agony, but she pushed forward. The horse led her through a break in the ridge, a narrow, windless hollow she had never seen before.
When she collapsed inside, she realized what it was: a natural cave, dry and shielded from the storm. Inside were old supplies, still intact: tools, blankets, jars of herbs, all packed neatly in crates marked N.H. Nora Hale. Mara laughed through her tears. "You never left me, did you?" She built a fire, treated her wounds with herbs, and waited out the storm. When the winds finally broke 3 days later, she limped back to the village, alive, exhausted, but triumphant. The mill still stood. The families she had saved were safe. Thomas ran to her as she emerged from the snow, his eyes wide. "We thought you were gone," he said, voice breaking. Mara smiled weakly, touching the medallion on her chest. "Not while the mountain remembers me." That spring, the villagers rebuilt what the storm had taken. Crops flourished in soil fed by the melting snow, and at the first thaw, Mara led the children of High Ridge to the hidden cave, Nora's Cave, and told them the story of strength, of survival, and how the mountain always remembers those who love it. When she finished, she looked toward the peaks and whispered, "Your lessons live on, Nora. The mountain still listens." And somewhere above in the wind that swept through the valley came a faint, familiar whisper in reply. "And so do you, child of the peaks." Spring returned reluctantly that year. Even as flowers bloomed in the valley, frost still clung to the peaks like stubborn ghosts. Mara Hale, no longer the frightened apprentice, but the mountain's chosen keeper, stood outside Nora's old cave with a lantern in hand. It had been months since the iron winter, but the cave still called to her. She had returned to it many times, bringing supplies and students, though she never ventured deeper than the first chamber. Something about the shadows beyond the stone archway made her pause, like a voice just out of hearing. Today, she came alone. The wind whispered through the pines as she stepped inside, the flame of her lantern flickering gold across the stone walls. The crates and tools Nora had left decades before still rested where they'd been placed, undisturbed. But behind them, something new caught her eye, a faint carving in the rock, half covered by moss. She brushed it clean with her glove. It was the same symbol as her medallion, a mountain, a rising sun, and beneath it, words etched in Nora's careful hand. "When the mountain sleeps, her heart still beats below." Mara frowned. Her heart? The cave tunneled deeper than she had realized. With each step, the air grew warmer, the walls glistening with veins of quartz that pulsed faintly in her lantern light. It felt alive, breathing. Finally, the passage opened into a vast chamber. In the center was a pool of water so clear it reflected the ceiling like a mirror. Steam rose gently from its surface, filling the air with the scent of stone and earth. And at the edge of that pool lay something wrapped in oilcloth. Her pulse quickened. She knelt and unwrapped it carefully, revealing Nora's old journal, bound in leather, dry despite the moisture. Inside, pages filled with neat, steady handwriting told stories she had never heard, not just of winter survived, but of something deeper. The mountain has a heart, an ancient spring beneath her bones. It warms the valley, feeds the rivers, keeps life, even in the coldest years. I found it once by accident, and I fear what might happen if others find it too. Mara's hand trembled as she read on. Nora had mapped the mountain's underground veins, the secret streams and geothermal channels that kept the valley alive. It was the source of warmth that made survival possible through the cruelest winters. No wonder the storm had been so fierce. The mountain's balance had shifted, and now its heart was restless. Mara's eyes lifted toward the pool. She felt heat radiating from it, not just warmth but power. The water shimmered with strange luminescence, swirling gently as though aware of her presence. Then came the whisper, soft, ancient, unmistakable. "Child of the peaks, you have found what must be guarded." She gasped and stumbled back, the lantern nearly slipping from her hand. The voice wasn't frightening, it was familiar. It was Nora's voice woven into the mountain's breath. Her mentor had known this would happen. She had left this secret for someone strong enough to protect it. Mara closed the journal slowly, pressing her palm to the rock beside her. The warmth beneath her hand pulsed like a heartbeat. "I'll protect it," she whispered. "I swear." From that day forward she did. She sealed part of the cave with stone, leaving only the entrance to the outer chamber for her students to visit. She told them the cave was sacred, a place of memory, not of power. Only a few trusted elders knew the truth, that beneath High Ridge lay a living spring, the source of the valley's life. As the years passed, the storms grew gentler, the harvest stronger. The people of High Ridge prospered, guided by the wisdom of the mountain woman's air. And when Mara looked to the peaks at sunset, the light catching her silver medallion, she sometimes saw a shimmer, like a figure standing where the wind met the sky. Nora Hale, watching, smiling, because the mountain had chosen its next guardian well. The mountain had always tested those who loved it. Nora Hale had learned that truth long ago, and now it was Mara's turn to face her own reckoning. The iron winter.
The mountain roared. Snow fell in the middle of summer. Mara gathered her students and rode hard for the cave, the medallion at her throat, burning hot as fire. Thomas followed beside her, his face pale beneath the storm clouds. "The valley's flooding," he shouted over the wind. "The river's boiling." Mara nodded grimly. The mountain's fighting back. When they reached the mouth of Nora's cave, Mara dismounted and ran inside, lantern in hand. The tunnels pulsed with red light, the glow of magma and fury beneath the earth. The pool that had once shimmered softly now churned like a storming sea. The whispers were deafening. Nora's voice and something older beneath it. "God, what is sacred? Mend what they have broken." Mara fell to her knees. "Tell me how," she cried. "I can't stop them." The medallion flared, flooding the chamber with golden light. The voice answered, not in words, but in knowing. The mountain's heart didn't need to be controlled. It needed to be healed. Mara pressed her hands to the earth, feeling its pain, the tearing, the burning, the fear. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the spring flow through her, through the stone, through the very air itself. The light from the medallion spread across the ground like veins of gold, sealing cracks, cooling the magma below. Outside, the storm began to calm. The snow melted into rain. The tremors faded. When Mara finally opened her eyes, the pool was still again, its waters glowing softly blue. The air smelled clean, like after a storm. She stumbled to her feet, drained but alive. The medallion's glow dimmed, settling into a steady warmth against her chest. By the time she returned to the village, the company had fled, terrified by what they called the mountain's wrath. The villagers rebuilt their fields, their homes, their faith, and Mara, quietly, without glory, kept watch from the ridge. In the years that followed, the legend grew. They said a young woman had stopped a mountain from tearing itself apart, that when she stood before the storm, the sky itself had bowed. Mara never claimed those stories. She simply smiled, tending her herbs, teaching new students, walking the paths Nora once walked. She lived to see High Ridge thrive again, its rivers running clear, its fields green, its people unafraid of winter. And when her own final winter came, Mara went up to the cave one last time. The mountain was quiet, peaceful, content. She placed Nora's journal on the stone beside the spring, whispering, "The mountain endures, so do we." She lay down beside the water, her hand resting on the medallion, and as the last light of day touched her face, the water shimmered gold.
Some say she became part of the mountain that day. Others say she walks its ridges still, watching over the valley when storms rise. Whatever the truth, the people of High Ridge know this. When snow falls early and the wind hums softly through the pines, it carries two voices, one of the woman who first survived winter, and another of the girl who healed the mountain's heart. Years passed. The world beyond High Ridge changed, but the mountain stood eternal. The old road that once wound toward the valley faded under moss and wildflowers. Few travelers came that way anymore, and those who did often paused at the carved stone marker by the pass, weathered but still legible. Here stood Mara Hale, the mountain's guardian. Children of the valley grew up hearing stories about her, how she had stood against the iron winter, how she tamed the storms and healed the land. To some, she was a hero. To others, a myth whispered by wind and smokewood. But to the elders, who still remembered the glimmer in her eyes and the warmth in her hands, she was real. And they taught their children to listen, to the creak of the pines, the hum of thawing ice, the soft sigh of wind between the ridges, because that was where Mara still spoke. Every spring when the thaw came, a strange thing would happen in the valley. The snow melted from the peaks, not in trickles, but in warm streams that carried the scent of pine and wild honey. Flowers bloomed earlier here than anywhere else. The soil stayed rich, the flocks were strong. And each year, on the first full moon of thaw, the villagers gathered at the edge of the old forest to sing. No one knew exactly when the tradition began, only that the song's words were carved in the last pages of Nora's journal. When the mountain wakes from sleep, her children rise, her heart shall keep. From frost to flame, from dusk to dawn, the mountain's soul forever strong. They called it the Song of the Peaks. Elders would close their eyes as they sang, feeling warmth on their cheeks even in the night chill. It wasn't just memory, it was presence. Some said they saw her shadow among the trees, or a woman's shape walking the ridge at dawn, her hair the color of winter wheat, her lantern glowing like a star. And once, many years after her death, a traveler came through the valley. He was an old geologist with weathered hands and eyes too curious for his own good. He'd heard rumors of a living spring beneath High Ridge, a geothermal vein that could power cities. The villagers warned him not to disturb the caves. He smiled, dismissed their talk as superstition, and went anyway. That night, the wind changed. It began as a whisper, then a low rumble, and finally a howl that shook the earth. The sky darkened, though no storm had been forecast. Trees bent, stones rolled from the slopes like dice in the hands of gods. The villagers lit their lanterns and stood outside, watching the clouds churn above the peaks. And through the thunder, a voice seemed to rise, faint but fierce. "You will not take what is not yours." When the storm cleared, the traveler was found at the forest's edge, dazed but alive. His maps and instruments had vanished. The entrance to the deeper cave was sealed by a fresh fall of stone, smooth and unbroken, as if the mountain itself had drawn shut its gates. The man left before dawn, pale and trembling. He told no one what he had seen, only muttering that the cave had eyes, that the mountain breathed. After that, no one came seeking the secret spring again. Decades passed. The valley became known for its strange warmth, its endless harvest, its gentle winters. Outsiders couldn't explain it. They said it was geothermal activity, a quirk of natural heat. But the locals knew better. They tended the soil with reverence, they sang the old songs,
And sometimes, when a young woman wandered into the woods, heart heavy, lost, afraid, the mountain would answer. Once, a girl named Ellie climbed the ridge after her parents' cabin burned in a lightning strike. She sat among the blackened trees, tears freezing on her cheeks. Through the mist came a faint sound, a melody, soft and familiar. She followed it to a hollow in the rocks where a lantern burned, though no hand held it. The flame flickered in rhythm with the song. And there, resting on a stone, lay a silver medallion engraved with a rising sun. When she picked it up, warmth flooded her chest. The next spring, Ellie became the youngest herbalist the village had ever known. Plants thrived in her care, and she spoke of hearing voices in the wind, old, kind voices that taught her how to heal the sick, how to calm storms before they broke. She never claimed to be chosen, but the people whispered anyway. They said the mountain had passed its heart to her, that Mara Hale lived on, not as a ghost, but as a song, as warmth in the soil, as the whisper in every woman who dared to face the winter and say, "I will endure." Far above, where snow met sky, the mountain slept and dreamed. Beneath its crust, the hidden spring pulsed softly, keeping time with the valley's life. In the reflection of that pool, if one looked close enough, there was the faintest image of a woman with strong shoulders, wind-tangled hair, and a lantern glowing gold in her hands. Her lips curved in a smile. The mountains would always test their children, but as long as courage found a home in the hearts of the living, they would never freeze again. And so, the legend of Mara Hale, the woman too weak to survive winter, became the oldest truth of High Ridge. That sometimes the weakest are the ones chosen to hold the world together.
Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.